spent the first 15 years of my career really working for the Department of Navy, DoD, a lot of long-term future stuff. Last 20 years, a series of technology startups, all of which on some level seek to achieve the same holy grail of kind of boiling the ocean every day and figuring out how the world works and modeling that world and simulating that world and figuring out strategic planning on that basis. So very long term in focus, good 20, 25 years at least. So based on the book, America's New Map, Restoring Our Global Leadership in an Era of Climate Change and Demographic Collapse. So I look at a world that America set in motion after the Second World War, a globalization, as we now call it, that was based on the internal rule sets of how our member states integrated with one another over time. We projected that abroad. We were enormously successful, but it came at a cost. Acceleration of climate change. It came at a certain transition, the demographic transition that countries have gone through, and it birthed the ultimate prize from a business perspective. And that is an emergent global majority middle class. Those three structural changes all happening at the same time, in my mind, take us from an east-west world to a north-south world in terms of integration. And I think we're already starting to see some weird hints about that with Trump and some of his more seemingly out of the blue statements regarding Greenland, Canada, Panama. And when you look at it from my perspective, it's less crazy than it sounds. It's more natural, and
Mm.
it really speaks to a future that's going to be about hemispheric integration for the United States. I caution all the time. Imagine the 22nd century histories that are going to be written about this century.
Hmm.
Because I could look back over the 20th century, and what I don't see is massive world wars. What I see is the doubling of human life expectancy at birth from
Mm.
1950 to 2000, and how that set in motion a lot of huge structural changes. So we tend to get fixated on the wars. I think right now there's this sense that there's going to be huge chapters in future histories about Iran and its nuclear program, or some sort of fight over Taiwan. I think there actually will be a chapter over Ukraine on the basis of the rise of sort of a military singularity in which robots and unmanned drones kind of took over the battlefield. But by and
Yeah.
large, these changes tend to be bigger and more structural. The aging of
Yeah.
populations around the world right now is stunning, really alters everything. And then the climate change is really taking a world and shifting around not just climate, but wealth, elemental wealth. I mean, land that's disappearing, from lower latitudes in terms of its usability and kind of magically appearing in northern or higher latitudes. And that's transfer of wealth that's not compensated, but is going to lead to some really big
Yeah.
pressures over time. Whenever you think about the future, you really have to locate the things that are kind of baked into history. Climate change is pretty much baked in. There's not much we
Mhm.
can to alter the next 4 or 5 decades. What mitigation efforts we make now may alter the end of the century and into the 22nd century. So there's a wave of inevitable things that are coming at us that are going to be huge changes, demand from us the capacity to consider what may seem like inconceivable actions from today's perspective, but ultimately are going to be ones that we pursue. And you can always kind of check yourself on that score by going back. When I got into the business at the end of the Cold War, there was an emerging sense that you were looking at a future world, long term, US and China economic dominated. Now, trying to tell anybody in the early 1990s laughed out of the room because we
Yeah.
were still stuck on the Russians coming back in a big resurgent way, or maybe Japan was going to take over the planet. We tend to get caught up in very near term things and see ourselves very much limited in terms of what we can choose to do about them, when we really need to think about those long-term inevitabilities. Because
Mhm.
when it's 20, 30 years off, some of these things, now you have the real flexibility and the
Yeah.
real places which narrow dramatically over time. Thinking ahead to one of your questions, the terrible isolating thing about working for the government and having a clearance, to
Mm.
me, is that you get kind of locked into this echo chamber world. There are such, like any field, the pressure on you to kind of conform to the conventional wisdom is profound. So that I argue that you're better off accepting sort of a career switching mentality. The economy and the nature of business today forces upon us anyway. You should really plan on having a career of going in and out of government if you want to be in the intelligence community over time, and that's the safest way to make sure you do
Yeah.
not get lost into a
Yeah.
very narrow perspective. The ability to go in and out, I think, is what's
Yeah.
missing the intelligence community. I'm a much better asset for that world now than I was when I was in it. The biggest problem I have with most intelligence, it tends towards the worst casing
Hmm.
out of self-preservation. And there is a tendency in going down that path to so complicate the journey or the perspective or the picture that you disarm the decision maker in question from any sense of I can move us towards a happy ending, a better outcome, something positive. And I think that's happened not just with decision makers in the last few years, but also with the public at large. America built this globalization world and was the great market maker of that world for decades. It sort of woke up in 2008 after some forever wars and the financial crash. And we looked around and we said, my God, we've created this multipolar world. Now we got to go back to being kind of looking out for ourselves, a market player more than a market maker. And it's sort of like the difference between being Bill Belichick coaching the Patriots versus Roger Goodell being the commissioner of the NFL. Belichick wants to win at all costs. Goodell wants the game to be preserved and to advance and to thrive. And we've had a hard time kind of coming off that market making role and moving towards something more balanced. We've done it in such a strong swing of the pendulum now that we're seeing, our current Secretary of State describe the global order as weaponized against the United States, which I think
Wow.
is,
Yeah.
is a vast overstatement because honestly, it reflects our values and it was built by us. And we were enormously advantaged by it over time. But we also accepted a certain amount of loss in order for the system, and other powers to rise slowly over time. And it's hard when you give people only very negative futures to avoid and you do not describe positive futures to achieve. It's depressing. It tends to represent sort of an institutional bias, and it can reflect that kind of insider echo chamber view of the world where you only talk about bad things. And so you only imagine bad things. It'd be very disabling, I think, to decision makers. This term we hear now, VUCA, it's all uncertain, complex, ambiguous. These are all stipulated in the career. I mean, if those words scare you, get the hell out now. You ought to be able to be very on with all of these. And the last thing you should do is pull out the real C word of chaos, which is a total myth. I
Yeah.
mean, my God, the amount of transactions and trade and movement of goods and services and people and ideas around this planet on a
Yeah.
daily basis, absolutely amazing. We think just because somebody's standing with a microphone in front of a camera in front of a fire scene somewhere that the
Yeah.
scene is chaos. A recent big report came out. They looked at all these experts. They asked about the next 10 years. And the majority of them said, we could very possibly have a world war in the next 10 years. And I thought to myself, could I have ever found a time in my lifetime where I couldn't find 60% of
Yeah.
foreign policy experts predicting a world war in the next 7 years? I resist the temptation to slap the term war on top of everything. I grew up in the shadow of the Second World War historically. Second World War was about 15,000 deaths per day for 10 years. Nowadays, we call something a war when it's 3 deaths a day or roughly 1,000 deaths in a year. And so we have wars on things like, toys babies shouldn't put in their mouths and stuff like that. And we equate everything in the same sort of over the top crisis mode. When in truth, if you just strip away the hyperbole, we live in the most predictable time humanity's ever seen with levels of transparency and knowledge awareness throughout the world that are absolutely stunning. And yet, even with arms, armed with all this information and such, we consider ourselves as baffled as ever and
Yeah.
as certain as ever and ready to spot chaos in this world all the time. And I just really resist that scaring the hell out of everybody business approach because I think it's really kind of pointless and it's a big turnoff for younger generations. And we're doing it very badly now with millennials and Gen Zs.
In a time away from industrial age, so to speak, war, where they used to say that the first casualty of war is the truth. And in the information age with info war, you might argue that the first casualty of info war is trust, and degrading that, and again the how that degrades the civic spirit of a nation as well.
I mean, I think that Putin going after the African American vote in 2016 was probably a much more influential operation than launching a kinetic war against Ukraine.